So Nate Weigert is our guest speaker from Indeed, and Nate is a senior recruitment evangelist from Indeed's Employer Insights team. And as part of Indeed's team, he blends data with industry trend analysis and shares Indeed's story behind and bringing the value of the company's programs and solutions to life. In his role, he focuses on crafting holistic, strategic solutions for clients to aid in solving their hiring challenges. So Nate, thank you so much for being with us today. I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cindy, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you all today. As mentioned, my name's Nate. I am one of the senior evangelists here at Indeed within our Employer Insights group, which is an extension of our marketing efforts within the organization. I've been with Indeed for a little over 7 years now. I just had my Indeediversary, as we like to call them, which in Indeed years is similar to dog years. So it feels like I've been here a very, very long time. But it's an exciting time to be with the company. There's a lot going on, obviously, from our side of the conversation, but obviously the industry as a whole has kind of gone through a bit of an upheaval over the last 2 years. So it's been an interesting moment to really be an observer and kind of a participant in the conversations that we've been having with our clients, as well as our business partners, to understand how we can continue to deliver on our mission here at Indeed, which is to help people get jobs. My function as an evangelist is very much what you'll see today, engaging with our various partners to help understand the challenges that y'all are facing, both from a market perspective, as well as a solutions perspective. I spend a lot of time with our product teams understanding how we can continue to evolve those tools to help in that hiring landscape. But the majority of the time I actually spend kind of on the research side of the house, focusing on our job seeker experience. Because at Indeed, our primary stakeholders are those individuals who are actively looking for new opportunities. And we know that we'd be lost without them as a provider to employers. So I spend a lot of time in surveys, in research groups, and really understanding how we can impact their experience and understand what's important to them today, and ultimately how those communications can be translated back to the employer so that everyone can continue to advance forward with the goal of making qualified hires in a timely manner. So today I'm kind of switching gears a little bit and I'm putting on my economist hat. This is a presentation that's actually primarily delivered by our team here at Indeed called the Hiring Lab, which is a group of economists who actually sit amongst the data with the BLS and other surveys and studies that are out there to understand kind of where the market is tending and trending. We don't make any forecasts here at Indeed just because we're not in the business of doing that. There are a lot of organizations that do that very, very well. We don't want to really step in that water. But today the conversation is really kind of entrenched in some of those data sets that we do have. A little plug for our fearless leader here at the Hiring Lab, Jed Kolko. For those of you who may be familiar with the name, he was actually just nominated is the correct word, by President Biden to join the group there as an undersecretary in the Department of Commerce. So he is going through the confirmation process as we speak, looking to probably join the administration here at the end of the year, early January. So a lot of what you'll hear today kind of comes from the mouth of Jed and his team, but I definitely want to do as much justice as I can to the data and the content that we've prepared, just understanding that it is a level of conversation that is a little bit different than what we're used to presenting from the Employer Insights perspective, but absolutely want to provide this to you today, as well as some insights as to how we might be able to continuously move forward with the conversation in terms of what's happening in the labor market today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and can I just get a quick thumbs up from somebody that you can see what I'm showing? Perfect. Thank you, Cindy. So again, the conversation today is really around the labor market and what we're seeing here at Indeed, as well as some other studies that are available kind of in one solidified fashion. As we all know, the market right now is incredibly competitive. There are a lot of new challenges that we're facing as employers, as recruiters. And my primary focus in terms of verticalization is the retail and hospitality sectors. So I've got some pretty keen insight and experience working in those industries and the conversations that we're having, and the commonality that we're hearing today from those organizations that we support is that talent is so hard to find and so hard to attract today. And a lot of that is going to be flushed out through our conversation today in terms of what we're seeing. There's no real short-sighting and or understating the fact that the labor market has changed dramatically in the last 2 years. Phrases like the Great Resignation have become prominent amongst our peers, amongst the media. It's a fact that's really affecting the labor market. And obviously what happened over the past 2 years, starting really at the onset of 2020 with the lockdown, affected all of us in ways that, some were personal, some were professional, but in terms of the reaction to the market, we're still kind of pulling ourselves out of, kind of the downward slide that we all experienced. When we look at what happened from the onset of the pandemic to where we are today. And the reason that the data set stops in September is we were doing a fairly in-depth analysis throughout the peaks and valleys of the pandemic. And we always had this earmarked date of September in mind when we were starting to prepare a lot of these conversations, because that was when the unemployment benefits nationally were expiring. And we wanted to kind of have that as a stake in the ground to get some indication as to how the markets were going to behave. Because prior to the expiration of those benefits, there was a lot of prophesizing that, as soon as those benefits expire, everything's going to be green. The grass is going to be so much greener on the opposite side of that from a recruitment perspective, because all the candidates are going to have to come back. Here we are now, obviously in December, we realize that is not the case. There are other factors in play. And a lot of this conversation is going to lean on some of that data. But what we're looking at here is essentially the job loss. And this comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the job loss over the course of the pandemic. So if we look at the end of 2019, we were essentially fairly flat in terms of new job growth. Going into 2020, we saw the dramatic drop off in March and April of 2020, where we lost in upwards of 20 million jobs. And then immediately we started to go into recovery mode. At the beginning of the summer of 2020, we started to see a healthy recovery. We thought maybe this was going to be a fairly quick pandemic. Our hopes were that the lockdown were going to solve the problems. And then obviously things began to shift. We've stayed constant outside of the 1 month in December of 2020 in terms of job growth. So after the significant loss of those 21 million jobs at the onset of the pandemic, the growth pattern has been fairly consistent. And there have been some pockets of activity that were optimistic and were indicators of potential growth and recovery. But overall, what we've seen is a fairly constant trend at a national level in terms of job growth as reported by the BLS. And we've continued to see those numbers through November of 2021. The last jobs report was fairly favorable in terms of the new numbers and decreased numbers of new unemployment claims coming out. However, we're still not out of the woods, and we now know that there's a new variant that is poking its head up. We don't know what the impact of that is going to be. Obviously, the Delta variant caused some real impact to the overall market. But I've just read some studies today, actually out of South Africa, that it appears the newest variant, the Omicron or whatever they're referring to it as, I just call it the O variant, appears to be less impactful as the Delta variant was. The medical impacts and the long-lasting contagion, it does not seem to be as high as the Delta variant. In terms of Indeed's data, what we're seeing is massive recovery on the platform over the last 12 months. Coming into January of 21, we saw fairly level pegging to where we were prior to the pandemic's onset. Where we are today is at about a 40% increase year over year to where we've ever been. So in terms of demand, there has never been a moment in time at Indeed in the 17 years that we've existed as a company that we've had more demand on our platform in the form of new job postings. So if we look at this particular graph, that zero sum date is January of 2020. So that was a fairly healthy point in time. The markets were very stable. The job market was fairly stable. And then obviously we fell off a cliff there at the onset of the lockdown. Fast forward to where we are today, we're actually 40% higher than we were prior to the pandemic. So what has happened over the last 12 months is that every employer to be named has come back at the exact same time with new and or more opportunities to fill. So seasonality really went out of the window this year. We didn't see a huge increase in terms of seasonal hiring because everyone was hiring at the exact same time. And that trend has continued throughout December. Typically, we see a drop off between early to mid-November in the seasonal hiring. Those pushes have continued. And it's not lost on me anytime I go out to any retail, hospitality venue, food service venue. Everywhere you go, there's a help wanted, now hiring sign on the door. That is the analog version of what we're seeing in the virtual reality, which is our platform. And we've also seen a new sense of urgency displayed by job seekers. So when job seekers do come to actively search, they're actively searching for roles that are looking to fill immediately. So what this speaks to is the mindset of today's job seeker. There is a true time element to their decision-making process when it comes to considering new roles. So employers that are using phrases like now hiring or hiring now as a portion of their job description and or job title are seeing better results on our platform from the perspective of job seekers actively searching for those types of roles in nature. What we've actually seen is the term hiring immediately or urgently hiring present itself as a searched term by job seekers in and of itself. So they're not even searching for, a front desk clerk or a delivery driver or a food service representative. They're searching for the terms now hiring or hiring immediately. What that tells us is they're not necessarily concerned about the nature of work. They just want to know that that employer is going to be actively putting them into play as an employee of record. So the sentiment here is not only how we craft and curate our content from a proactive perspective, but it also speaks to the level of responsiveness that we need to ensure that we are instilling within our teams. If you're not responding to candidates that have applied to your position within 24 hours, the likelihood is those individuals have gone on and applied to other positions and are essentially spoken for at that point. Thinking about it from the housing market perspective, if you're not putting in a bid today, the likelihood is that house is off the market tomorrow. We kind of want to look at talent in that same element. It's really that golden 24 hours that we have to engage with these individuals effectively. Some sectors have boomed and others have ultimately, felt the impact a little bit more than others in the last 12 months. We see that there are some sectors that are outpacing the economy on average. Those are those top four listed here, inclusive of loading and stocking. And then towards the bottom, where we're seeing a slower recovery, are probably the markets that are near and dear to your heart. Those sales and hospitality and tourism roles are slower to react to the market and are slower to react than the market, We're still seeing improvement over the previous 4 weeks when this data was collected. However, we're still seeing a slower engagement of this talent overall, but we are seeing some pockets of optimism in terms of overall recovery and improvement in terms of talent interest. In terms of job postings, we're breaking this now down by category. So if I look at that blue line being our total representative job postings on the platform, we also have it now broken down by retail, hospitality, and food service. Seeing there that hospitality and tourism is the most lagging of all of the markets that we measure. in terms of overall job posting. So what this tells us is ultimately the impact was most significant to the hospitality and tourism space, and their recovery, to be expected, has been a little bit slower than others, just because of obviously the rollout and the freedom of individuals to travel and ultimately get to some of these properties and locations has been somewhat stalled by the various stages of the pandemic and the various variants that have come through. We are still seeing improvement. Obviously, we see that we are up over that previous 2020 level, but it's just a slower margin of growth that we're seeing specific to the hospitality and tourism space, where retail and food service are right on par with our overall average. Some other areas that have really boomed, no surprise, is kind of that personal care and health space, where the demand has been astronomical in terms of needing to find talent to address, some of the well-being concerns that were arisen through the pandemic. Another factor that is a brand new measurement for us that we never thought we would be measuring is the requirement of vaccination and job postings. Obviously, looking back to the beginning of the year, it was not. There was zero representation of jobs having vaccination requirements in any sort of job description, to where we are today. Obviously, that number is significantly higher. What we want to address here is transparency. If it is a necessity and or requirement of the organization, the transparency of that language being present within your job postings is something that we want to encourage, because not only do we see a higher level of engagement by job seekers when that available language is present in the job posting, the apply rate is significantly higher than a job posting that doesn't have any conversation and or communication about any COVID related matters. Really, the takeaway from this slide for me, and one exercise that I lead on a regular basis, is what we call a content workshop. The exercise for me and the takeaway from this content is, if you're still using a job description that looks similar to the job description that you had posted back in 2019 or at the beginning of 2020, it's really time for you to reconsider the message that you're putting out there. You have to have language within the body of your opportunities that not only explains what the requirements are pertinent to vaccination, but also what measures of safety and what protocols are in place to ensure employment safety. That is a factor that is being researched and observed by job seekers at a rate that we've never seen before, for obvious reasons. And especially when we're talking about quote unquote frontline workers, individuals who are going to be in person and face-to-face contact with consumers, we have to give them some semblance of an understanding as to what their safety protocols are going to be and what parameters are going to be there to instill or enlist their personal safety. In terms of vaccination requirements, we're seeing increases across the board in terms of where that's popping up. Obviously, that home health is going to see a significant requirement and or effective change to the overall percentage in terms of presence of vaccination requirements in that space, but it really does cover the gambit. And we're seeing significant uptick in its presence across the board. Another factor that is ultimately playing into our hands in one way or another, either negatively or positively, is what we speak to as the quits rate, or the quote unquote great resignation. What we know is that certain organizations are feeling the pinch of individuals quitting at a higher rate than others. Retail, trade, leisure, and hospitality feeling it at the highest rate than anyone else. So we know we have job seekers and or employees who are leaving our roles at a fairly high rate, and this data is just validating that. What this also gives us an idea of understanding is, where else can we potentially be looking for talent that's experiencing a similar pain? So if we know there's another organization, be it professional and business services, who are experiencing that high level of turnover, potentially we can attract those individuals into our opportunities. just giving us kind of a roadmap of talent, where they lie, where they're potentially going to be uncovered, and ultimately where we have opportunities to engage that we may have not historically looked for transferable talent from a skill set perspective. The next piece we want to talk to is the supply side. Obviously, the demand is off the charts. Where do we stand in terms of overall supply? Unfortunately, we're still a little bit lower than where we'd like to be. We ran a survey through the summer asking job seekers about how actively they're searching and what their behaviors are in terms of looking for new work. And there's still some hesitation. There's no denying that there was a bit of a hold pat, stay firm where you are with your current employment that existed throughout the pandemic and continues to kind of be prevalent in the market today. What we've seen from an overwhelming perspective is that the majority of individuals that we spoke to in this individual survey are passively searching. So while they're still actively searching for opportunities, they're still passive in nature. So maybe an opportunity crosses their desk and they review it. Maybe they're receiving a note through a LinkedIn outreach or a resume contact. Maybe part of their network is engaging and they're passively considering those opportunities. What we're not seeing is the big surges of activity that we'd like to, of individuals actively looking in an urgent manner. So we're only seeing about 10 to 15% of those individuals actively looking in an urgent manner, where historically those numbers would have been in the 30 or 40 percentile pre-pandemic. So we still do have some withholding of engagement from job seekers today, which is no surprise. And a lot of that still has to do with not necessarily the Delta variant anymore. Obviously, that's still very prevalent in the market and kind of in the landscape of the country. We do now see the omnivirus posing some risks, but both of these variants and just the presence of COVID and not full vaccination at the level that gets us to that herd immunity number is going to have an impact on both supply and demand. It's going to reduce some of the appetite of consumers going into in-person activities. We're starting to see some real recovery in terms of activities in real life fashion and in-person capacities, but the bigger impact is going to be on that worker supply. We do see that increased case counts across the map do have a direct impact on employers and employees' consideration of new opportunities and or putting themselves out there. And the overwhelming concern that still lays very, very prevalent to families is the potential disruption due to school activity. For the most part, schools are back in person across the map, but we do still see pockets of disruption taking place. When there is a case that does take place or exists in a classroom, the impacts that then play out across the board and ultimately downstream to the parents who are ultimately responsible for either taking time off, working from home, whatever that opportunity and situation looks like, the impacts of those are having a direct impact. And we actually have some data that speaks to that here in just a moment. So the factors that we're still considering are there's still some significant caution by job seekers around the pandemic. They're not looking directly at roles that place them at risk. And some data that we ran actually indicated that this was back in September when we were still really addressing that unemployment benefit impact. But we saw just over 3 million of the surveyed adults that we spoke to who haven't worked in that previous week. But the indication as to why they hadn't worked was because of worries of contracting or spreading the COVID virus. And that was up by nearly 1 million from a survey that ended back in August. So some of that strain and fear was definitely still present. But that disruption to in-person school has had a negative impact on the workforce in general, but more so to the female and mothers of the world, unfortunately. And what we've seen is that employment of mothers fell significantly as compared to fathers with children. So what that, I'm sorry, fathers obviously have children. Men with children, men versus men without children. The impact to men and women, unfortunately, there is a disparity here. Ultimately, the good, bad, or indifferent when it comes to taking care of children and or the impacts of school schedules, what we found is that the impact is significantly greater to mothers and females in general. And it's echoed here in the data where we see that having an employed spouse was the most commonly cited reason for lack of urgency when it comes to a job search. So COVID fears were up there for sure back in June, but looking in September, that employed spouse was the primary reason why an individual was staying pat and or not considering new opportunities. So that shared responsibility of taking care of the home provided a bit of a buffer and security to the audience that we surveyed. And the primary stated reason an individual was not urgently looking for new opportunities was due to the fact that they had a spouse employed that provided them that flexibility to not need to go to work in that particular time frame. Then next, when we're looking at the number of hires that we're making per job opening, what we've seen is that there's a significant increase in activity in certain markets where some areas are continuing to struggle. Construction being one that has really gone off the charts in terms of the capacity to hire, even through the pandemic. Construction was one of those critical elements that were allowed to stay actively working throughout the cycle of the pandemic, and hiring matched that, as we can see here in the data. When we look at retail, when we look at leisure and hospitality, there's a downturn in terms of the overall number of positions being filled. And that speaks to what we saw from that quit rates number. There's lower interest today in those particular spaces than we've seen historically. And we have a bit of a departure from that industry. So it's causing us to now look into spaces where we may not otherwise have researched and or considered talent, because ultimately and unfortunately, the truth of the matter is we have a smaller audience share than we did prior to the pandemic. Wages are a big factor for why individuals are considering roles outside of the retail and hospitality space. Even while we've seen growth year over year by about a measurement of 4%, we're still seeing from job seekers that their primary reason for considering a new role and or for leaving the industry as a whole is still down to pay. We also know that if we're not paying at a competitive rate, we're going to miss out on a massive audience of opportunity, where we see job seekers primarily looking for opportunities that have significant overtime availability, sign-on bonuses, et cetera. We want to ensure that we are competitive with our wage and compensation structures to ensure that we're not only retaining the talent we currently have, but we're attractive to that audience that's considering roles that may otherwise fall to one of our competitors and or one of our competitor industries. And we talk about those incentive offerings that are coming from employers. They're at an all-time high as well. When we look at the share of job postings that advertise an incentive in the title, we're nearly at 6% when it comes to the overall percentage of jobs on Indeed. So over 20 million job postings, about 6% of those job postings are blatantly advertising a hiring incentive of some sort, be it a sign-on bonus, be it increase in pay after a period of time, some level of incentive to the compensation structure is absolutely an element that we're starting to track and measure. And we're seeing significant traction with job seekers when that incentive language is available in the posting. Another piece that may or may not be important to you, but it's important to the market as a whole, so I do want to cover it and speak to it a little bit, is remote work. Obviously, remote work during the pandemic bubbled up quite a bit because it was, in many cases, the only way in which an individual could potentially work. Obviously, in the retail and hospitality space, a large portion of that individual audience doesn't have the ability to work in a remote manner. But where applicable and where appropriate, incorporating remote or work from home into a job posting is another best practice that we absolutely want to encourage, because it will garner a higher level of responsiveness from job seekers. The presence of that remote terminology and or flexible schedule is very attractive to the job seeker today. And we want to ensure that, again, when appropriate, we speak to that. And we do want to be as transparent as possible when we think about what remote work means versus work from home. Remote by design typically refers to a position that will always be remote in nature. You'll never have a requirement to visit an office. You'll never be in a position where you're going to, have flex hours, et cetera. Whereas work from home very well could mean work from home right now, but pending some lessening of restrictions, et cetera, there is an expectation that you're going to be in office at some point in time. So just being transparent and really thorough with the understanding of how that is communicated to the individual is definitely something that we want to encourage. Again, remote terms continue to grow in popularity and prominence. The work from home and teleworking has stayed fairly flat since the onset of the pandemic. However, this remote term has continued to grow. So when we think about things that we can do to ultimately recruit today, kind of some tactics and some leave behinds for y'all. The first thing is elevate those pay packages, or evaluate those pay packages. I don't like the term throw money at the problem, but right now, when we look at the constraint that we have within the audience and the market, there is a real need and necessity to evaluate how much we're paying as compared to our competitors. And it's not just in the form of base pay. It could be that you're paying more on weekends, you're paying more for night shifts than you would have historically. You have the ability to throw some retention money at the problem. Maybe 3 months after initial hire, they get a $500 to $1,000 retention bonus. Anything that we can do to incentivize the individual is absolutely a not best practice by the framework of the conversation, but it's definitely something that we want to review, because ultimately that's going to play into our hands in terms of attracting the audience where it may be looking for new opportunities. Remote work, again, where appropriate, is ultimately going to be a factor that we want to consider. Flexibility is absolutely of importance to job seekers today. When we think about, again, that balance of not just work life, but work life and school when children are part of the conversation, we definitely want to be cognizant and considerate of that and offer more flexibility when and where we can. Another piece that historically is an area where we may have been more stringent in terms of our consideration is gaps in employment. There's going to be a lot of gaps in employment on resumes as you view them today. The reason being is that there was a pandemic on, there was a lockdown in place. A lot of people didn't have the ability to either take on work for personal reasons, for physical reasons, for lifestyle reasons, et cetera. There's going to be some areas where we have gaps in employment that we just have to overlook. If you see someone that's worked for multiple companies over a period of 12 months, that's not necessarily a bad look over the last 2 years. They may have had to job hop at no fault of their own. The employer very well may have, had to let them go for various reasons. So when we look at resumes today, employment history needs to be less of a mainstay of concern and really looking at the critical elements that they possess from a work capacity and skill set. And understand that there's going to be an uneven recovery across the board. There's going to be smaller recruiting pools for us to draw from. We just know this is a factor. We've seen that this space, the hospitality, food service, and retail space, ultimately is going to affect how we get and attract talent. We've seen that there's been an increase in individuals moving away from our industry. So we're going to have to attract from outside of our traditional pools. And just knowing that that transferable skill set is absolutely something that we're going to be considerate of. Other things that I do want to just note is that we are seeing an increase in job seeker interest in employer status, if you will. Job seekers are doing more research about employers as a whole. We've seen about a 300% increase in activity on our company page product. It's a free product. You all would have a company page on Indeed, and you can manage and engage with it as much as you want. Historically, this has been where job seekers have gone to read reviews about employers. They want to see what the existing population, existing workforce is saying about you as an employer, and kind of get some dirt on, who you are, good, bad, and indifferent. It's kind of the glass door element of the Indeed platform. During the pandemic, we saw a significant increase in job seeker engagement on what we call the About Us section, which is where employers tell their story, tell what initiatives are important, what's going on at the company, who's hiring, who's not, et cetera. And the reason for this is that employees, or job seekers rather, are concerned about what protocols are in place and what measures you're taking as an employer to not only ensure their physical safety, but their career stability. So they want to know a little bit more about the company as they make a consideration as to whether or not to apply within that opportunity. Lastly, leave you with a few best practices for boosting visibility in this very constrained job market. First and foremost, ensuring that we're not using 2019's job postings. Ensure that the current jobs that we are posting and advertising reflect today's reality. Have some language in there about COVID protocols, about vaccination requirements, et cetera. Underscore your commitment to employee safety, using those sense of urgency phrases like now hiring or hiring immediately. When I do my content workshops, I tell every employer that I meet with, I don't care if you're hiring for a CEO or a dishwasher, every job that you post today should have some sense of urgency associated with it. Being it hiring now, immediately hiring, currently looking for, some language that expresses the urgency of the role. We have to match that to the job seeker behavior. Job sponsorship is something that I won't get too much into the weeds with in terms of product placement, but if there is a role that is of dire need and dire vitality to the organization, consider having a conversation with an Indeed representative around how we can elevate that position over time. And then finally, look for transferable skills. The market is constrained. We know that talent exists out there. We know that opportunities are not necessarily universal, but skills are. We want to ensure that we're looking for talent appropriately. And we want to look for individuals that, even though their resume may not speak to the experience that we're looking for, the skill sets that they possess absolutely do. We want to ensure that we're considering talent as appropriately as possible and looking for talent outside the boundaries of our normal consideration. So with that, I will pause. I'll stop talking for a little while. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all may have and or any other topics that y'all would like to discuss.
Great. And again, if you have a question, feel free to just unmute yourself at this point and ask your question, or raise your hand, or type it, however you like. Well, I'll start with a question. So Nate, the remote work thing is interesting, and obviously in our industry, it's really not an option for many of our locations, certainly by nature of restaurants and hotels, we have to be on site. So how do you see that sort of impacting us long term? I mean, is this something that's here to stay? Is this something that we're going to have to figure out a way to combat over the long haul? Or is it something that you see kind of waning as hopefully COVID eventually declines?
Yeah, Lord willing. I think that, yes, to answer your question, fairly shortly, I do believe that there will be a time where remote work does, kind of level out and return to pre-pandemic levels. What that looks like, I don't necessarily know. I know a lot of employers have moved into a fully remote, future looking capacity. Like Indeed, for instance, we're fully remote across 95% of our jobs now. If you want to be, like, we're offering flexible schedules, et cetera, but have moved into that pattern of remote. However, one thing I do, while remote may not be an ideal situation for y'all, it does open up some opportunities to potentially advertise and or instill what the benefits and or flexible schedule that's available. So where remote may seem very attractive to a lot of people, I always thought I wanted to work remotely until I had to for the last 2 years. And I realized how much I don't want to work remotely anymore. But the flexibility of schedule is, I think, the more important element for y'all. How can you advertise and promote what flexibility you do offer within your roles? It may not be remote work, but maybe it's the fact that it's not a straight 9 to 5. Maybe it is more nights and weekends type role, or you work 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and still have some flexibility therein. I think that's probably your industry's best combat against that remote worker or a candidate that's looking for remote work. But I do think over time, the remote work movement, if you will kind of die down. And candidly, I think there's going to be a bit of a spring awakening that occurs once COVID kind of does settle itself in. And people are going to realize that it's really nice to actually have to spend 30 minutes driving to work, because I get that free brain time, and then I actually get to experience and interact with real live individuals in person. So I think there's going to be there's going to be a shift in the winds, I think, for a while as we kind of come out of this lockdown situation. And ultimately, I think flexibility is probably the more important term that we want to focus on.
I think that's really good advice. We do have a question from Carly. Carly's asking, has training come up as a trend in job posts? Is that something that people are either posting about or job seekers are looking for?
So it depends on how we're framing it. I think there's always been an appetite for advancement, right? So job seekers are looking for opportunities that express some level of advancement through the organization, growth opportunities. Paid training is definitely a benefit that I would list out within your jobs if that's an option, because a job seeker wants to know that if they're going to be required to do some sort of training, that they're going to get paid to do it. That's a listed benefit that I would definitely encourage. And I think the more that you can create those types of benefit packages that are longer than the requirements package, that's always an advantageous opportunity and more desirable role for a job seeker. There's an adage out there that if you're going to list out 5 requirements to a candidate, you need to list out 5 benefits as well, because job seekers by nature are selfish. They're looking out for themselves. They want to know what they're going to get out of this role. So we always want to make sure that we pair requirements with benefits, and paid training is definitely a benefit.
Great, thank you. That was great. Anybody else have any questions?
I do, Cindy.
Go ahead, Nate.
So Nate, do you guys see any trends with alternative workforces? So retirees, part-time, mother's hours, as a way to try to offset some of the labor shortages that we're experiencing in the hospitality space?
So part-time for sure. There's always been an appetite for part-time. In terms of kind of that alternative set, retirees and mother's hours, we would probably stray away from that, just because there becomes the potential that we're targeting based on demographic. And we want to kind of stay out of that language. We don't want to encourage and or potentially discriminate based on one factor or another. Not saying that's what you were looking to do in any way. Obviously, you're looking to appeal to a particular audience. But I think there's less of us focusing on that and more of how we can appeal to all job seekers, because I think there is going to be, some pockets for opportunity. We do see, a lot of individuals retired early. During COVID, there were a lot of earlier than scheduled retirements that took place just as a kind of byproduct of the pandemic. And I think some of those individuals may look to return to the market in a part-time fashion. So part-time work is always something that we're measuring to see what percentage of roles are part-time versus full-time.
Great. Okay. Anyone else? Any other questions? Okay, well, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Nate, for your expertise today. It was really very insightful, super helpful, and obviously something that's super top of mind for everybody here. So we really appreciate your being with us today. We welcome you to stay on and join us as Chip presents, but we certainly understand if you have other places to be. So
yeah, unfortunately, I do have to drop off, but thank you all very much. And Cindy, I'll go ahead and I'll email you this presentation as well, so you'll have a copy of it to share with the group.
Perfect. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that.